So if I could ask the speakers to join us on the panel, and also Jelena, who was with us on the last panel, and Kamil Zabielski from the Norwegian Export Credit Agency to join us. And because we have a nice mix here of practitioners as well as researchers, I think we should take advantage of that and also ask questions about practice and in addition to questions about principle and law. Maybe to begin with, I'd ask Kamil if you had any thoughts on what you heard, and maybe say a few words about what you do at GIEC and how it relates to what we heard today.
Okay. Turn this on?
Just start speaking.
Is it on? Yeah, sorry. So my name is Kamil Zabielski. I previously worked for the Ethics Council, actually, for many years. I was responsible for conducting investigations for them and providing recommendations. And many of the recommendations that I've worked on have become public documents. But I'm not going to say too much about that. I think that one of the challenges that the fund has as a minority shareholder, the same way as investors of bonds or insurance in our case, is that often these are financial institutions and financial products in situations where you might have very limited leverage in order to actually do anything about the impacts that that company which you're investing in or that company you're providing insurance in is causing. Now, if you look at, for example, the UN Guiding Principles or the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, because you don't have leverage doesn't mean you don't have to do anything. I mean, it's very clear that even if you don't have leverage, you should conduct due diligence. And then based on that due diligence, which you have done, determine whether or not, well, we don't have leverage here, should we try to gain leverage in order to influence the impacts? And if not, we need to make a decision whether or not we want to be part of this investment or not. And this is what we are doing at the Norwegian Export Credit Agency. I don't know how many of you are familiar with export credit. So very briefly, what export credit is Export Credit Agency is a public agency which provides government-backed guarantees or insurance to a company in its home country that wants to do business abroad. So take an example of a Norwegian producer of a turbine. That turbine is going to go to a dam project abroad. That turbine producer is going to go to a bank to get a loan to make that turbine. That loan will then be backed by an export credit guarantee or insurance, right? So that insurance will cover things like commercial risk or political risk if there's a military coup or expropriation or something like that. So the exporter and the buyer don't have to cover all the costs of that loan if the export doesn't go through. And these kind of guarantees are very favorable. Many exporters want to have this kind of guarantee because it's backed by the Norwegian state, and that attracts other investors into the project. And so in Norway, we have an approach which is based on the UN Guiding Principles. So we have a 5-step due diligence process which we apply in all of our transactions, irregardless of whether or not we have leverage in that transaction or not. So I'll briefly go through that because it's also applicable for other types of transactions, including minority shareholders. The first is identification of risk, environmental and social risks. So we have certain questionnaires that all exporters have to fill out. We conduct online research. We conduct site visits in order to gain information. We also, step 2 is we assess that information. So we actually require environmental and social impact assessments from our projects. And then we review those impact assessments against international standards. So you may be familiar with IFC performance standards. IFC is the private lending arm of the World Bank. They have very detailed standards for environmental and social impacts. So we benchmark against these standards and we say, if that project does not align with these standards, then you have to cover those gaps. So step 3 is we take action by mitigating those impacts through legally binding conditionalities in our agreement. So we have a policy agreement where it states specifically that you must do X and X with respect to human rights, environment, etc., or else this guarantee is not valid. And then we follow this up with legally binding monitoring reports. And then finally, we disclose all this information. So you can go on our website and you can, all the high-risk projects, you can actually find the impact assessments on these projects. And that is a position that we have disclosure at least 30 days before providing support. So in sum, I just want to say that because you don't have leverage doesn't mean you shouldn't do due diligence, okay? And I think that is a concept which has not yet come through in the financial sector.
I just wanted
Yeah,
to
Anita.
on that. Regarding the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, there is leverage in the sense that if you divest or you exclude the company, well, then they're not going to have that investment anymore. So that's the leverage that you have, even if you're a minority shareholder. And if you're 2% in a humongous company, you've got a lot of leverage in there. What you're doing at the Export Credit Agency is very similar to what the World Bank got around to doing after many years. But that's a little bit more difficult if you're talking about 7,000 companies that you're investing in. So it's a little bit different, I think. But my suggestion, in addition to maintaining the Ethics Council separate, is that in NBIM, the bank arm, you actually have to put in more effort at following the OECD guidelines. Now they've set up for children's rights, water, and climate change, but not the other parts of the OECD. So I just want to add that. Go ahead.
The floor is open for people who would like to ask questions. Please.
Sorry, we've heard a lot about guidelines that are focused on energy production, and I'm just wondering if there are guidelines that focus also on the energy consumption side, and the companies that are driving up energy consumption. Do we have to think about, because it just seems to me if we're excluding investments in energy production, but we're still investing in things like shopping malls that drive up consumption, then is that actually going to affect, is that actually going to have the impacts we want it to have?
Any reactions from the panel members?
Go ahead.
Okay, thanks for the question. And I think from our perspective, we take sort of one battle at a time, and what we're looking at now is to shift investments from one sector where we know there's sort of extreme environmental damage to another one where it's substantially less and where capital is actually needed. So that's the first step, and I'm not aware that there are any other guidance for high consumption companies.
Yeah, maybe just very briefly. There was an interesting article in The Economist with a Tyrannosaurus Rex on the front cover saying, yesterday's oil. And previously a lot of people talked about peak supply. But now that more unconventional techniques are becoming available, that's probably not relevant anymore. So this article was about peak demand, whether it's through taxes, shifting away from fossil fuels to renewables, whether it's through changing consumer preferences by having more low carbon energy, electricity generated products like green energy for households, cars, etc. I think that's definitely important, both for governments to take action on changing demand and also for customers itself, like including us.
Anyone else on the panel? Tineke, I think you had your hand up.
Thank you. I have a question for Ivo. In the Netherlands, as you know, there's this Dutch NGO, Urgenda, which has started last month with a crowd litigation against the Dutch government, stating that the Dutch government is lagging behind in taking climate change measures and developing policies and implementing them. Would that be a typical factor in the analysis that you propose to apply to state bonds, to sovereign bonds, as having an impact in the environmental arena? That would be one. And the second question is, why are you not including in your research bonds issued by multinationals? Or maybe I misunderstood that part. Okay,
No,
thank
you didn't misunderstand it. I mean, this is just one pilot project under the Natural Capital Declaration. So when I met Global Food Footprint Network, they produce an annual footprint for countries. So because their data is only applicable to countries, did we decide to focus on sovereign bonds because of that data. We equally want to start a project, and it could be with Truecost or MSCI or anyone else, on corporate bonds as well. And in terms of, I hadn't heard actually about this this crowdfunding initiative. Crowd litigation, right? Right. Okay. I mean, I think it comes back to a certain part of this conference. I mean, what you see with this project is that it focuses specifically on scrutiny or disruption of supply chains because of changing environmental phenomena. So whether we do left or right, the continuous demand and the disruption of it through supply chains will ultimately affect financial markets. So it focuses specifically on operational risks that companies and countries, through their companies, are exposed to in terms of their GDP and other factors such as social political unrest, etc., and how that can be integrated in sovereign credit risk. Because whether we want it or not, I mean, I like this initiative. It may get through or not, but we can't wish away the enormous increase in commodity prices, for example, which is definitely on the one hand related to surging demand by China, India, and other emerging markets, as well as scrutiny of supply due to weather extremes, etc.
Please, next question.
Thank you. Two questions on the Norwegian oil fund. Read from the papers that, well, it's gigantic, $800 billion. There's an intention to split it to a equity fund and a bond fund. Are there other intentions to further cut it down to smaller pieces, say blue chip equity and other equity investment? That's my first question. And then the second question on the role of active ownership. It raised quite a lot of publicity that the oil fund appointed a member to the nomination committee of Volvo Corporation. I see that as a very small step as an active owner, taking into account the huge size of the fund. Are there other plans to increase the level of activity, say for instance, referring to Janet Dine's speech yesterday, to require more information from the multinational enterprises on their activities in the world?
I've heard about the splitting, but I haven't heard of the further splitting up to the blue chips. As far as the other part, I did pick up that they did put a person on the board, and I think that could very well continue in that direction if you have that possibility, because of course that's an inside way of informal engagement with the companies, and that would be more formal, essentially. So I think that could be good if it promotes sustainable development in my book, but that's not the way the fund is, not just focused on ethics alone, of course. So it's looking at financial issues too, I'm sure, like any board member would in these companies. So my piece on that would be that, of course, they should also look at the sustainable development part. So that'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
Next on my list is Andrew.
My question is for Ivo. I may have misunderstood kind of part of your argument, but it seems that you're saying that if we rate sovereign bond issuers based on environmental and social performance, that this will influence bond investors when they're choosing which sovereign bonds to invest in. Is that completely wrong?
No. So what I'm saying is that at the moment, environmental social factors are not incorporated in the valuation of the price of bonds, and that there's a necessity to do that, or at least to assess if there is a certain amount of risk that's unaccounted for that investors should know about?
Yeah, because at the moment, say with, I've just moved back from Australia, and Australian sovereign bonds are in great demand because Australia is backed by massive natural resources, but there's no possibility of sustainability coming into that calculation. The point is that the investors in Australian sovereign bonds know that their debt is backed not only by paper money, like most countries, but it's also backed by hard, huge amounts of natural resources. So it seems quite hard to see how you're going to tip from prioritization of getting your hands on what's left of the Earth's resources to these investors thinking more sustainably.
Yeah, but I mean, like everybody talks about stranded assets. So I mean, the reason why Australia has a huge boom is because of mining. Bloomberg just launched a new tool that allows investors to use different sorts of scenarios to incorporate carbon risk in valuation of companies. The moment governments do get together and sign on a new climate change agreement, the valuation of all these listed and also non-listed extractive companies in Australia is going to be reduced by dozens of percentages, which will massively impact the Australian government. So as an investor, whether you do something about it, yes or no, at the very least you should know about these risks and make your own decision of how you want to account for these. And once you do, governments will see the effect of it.
I think your answer tells you why Australia won't sign that agreement.
Is it Raphael? Yeah, here in the middle.
My question is for Kamil. Could you tell us if the Export Credit Agency, have they given any guarantees to any businesses in the fossil fuel sector? And a second question, having worked for the Ethics Council, do you have any insight into the possible decision on whether the oil fund will continue to invest maybe in coal producers? And maybe just a final issue for the panel, how sustainable do you think the oil fund for Norway is? Is there going to be a decision eventually that, you know, Norway will have to stop oil and gas construction and production?
Okay, so we'll hand first to Kamil, and then if others on the panel have something they'd like to add.
Sure. I'll let you take the coal question then. When it comes to guarantees to the fossil fuel sector, the answer is yes, of course. I mean, Norwegian export, at least, is very much dependent on the offshore oil and gas sector. I would say 70% of our business is providing guarantees to the offshore oil and gas sector. So drilling ships, platforms, supply vessels, these kind of things. An interesting thing to note is that export credit agencies have a common agreement through the OECD. So all the 34 countries have an agreement that, yes, we're going to look at environmental and social impacts of these guarantees we provide. However, when it comes to mobile assets, or what they like to call mobile assets, these are basically projects that are not in a specific location. So a ship, a train, or airplane, that's outside of the agreement. So all export credit agencies, when it comes to these kind of things, they don't really have to look at them. We've said that this doesn't really make sense, and so we also do due diligence on the ships that we provide guarantees to. We look at clean design from the environmental perspective. We look at the shipyards where they're being built, because often they're being built abroad. At least the hulls of the ships are always being built abroad. And we look at the operation of the ship. So what are the labor and working conditions, health and safety standards on the ship during operation? So we've taken an approach which is a little bit different from the OECD. But we do not do guarantees to the fossil fuel sector on land-based projects. It's only offshore.
Anita, and then Arild.
Yes, that gives me the opportunity to get round to when I made my presentation and ran out of time. When I said that it changed its name to the pension fund, that was aimed at that we're looking for, in the future, it'll be so expensive with the social welfare that we have to have a way of funding that, so that's, the money's going there. So we're not just going to think oil. However, I think that is wonderful because then it's not called the oil fund, it's a pension fund. And then you can start moving away from oil because we have to move away from oil. We heard the speaker yesterday. We're not talking about the next century, we're talking about now. And the 2 degrees, many will say, we're past it, it's over. So what are we doing all this for anyway if it's all going to go the wrong way? I think we still have to hope that we can pull something together, even if the international negotiations haven't gone so well on climate change. So the fund being a universal investor, and the whole point of the fund was to have us be able to stabilize the economy instead of bringing it all in and then disrupting the economy. When the HSBC bank actually came out and said that the investments in oil are going to go downhill because of taking then regulations on climate change accordance with the climate negotiations eventually, right? Then those oil stocks will not be worth very much. So obviously we have to get out of oil, and it's kind of hypocritical to get your investments in oil companies out and then not stop producing oil when you're one of the ones who has the big impact on that front. Even if we're not using it in Norway, we're exporting it. So I think it's hugely important we have to get out of oil. I'm not speaking for the government, I'm not the Norwegian government, but I can say that I think there's a big move and a lot of people are worried about this. So this is the way it has to go. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but at least we can start talking about that this is the plan down the road. I think that would be a good idea. And call it a pension fund, it's fine.
Arild.
Yeah, I agree, that's a good idea. But a couple of additional points. One thing is, it's important to be aware of that the mandate of the fund is a political decision. I mean, it's the Ministry of Finance doing their best to keep discussions on the fund outside the political debate, but that's their way of maintaining their business as usual approach to it. But it's a political issue, and if you want to change the mandate on the issues that I addressed earlier, it's something that the politicians should do. And just to comment to the GIEC investments in or support for fossil fuels, it's a bit of a paradox actually, among many Norwegian paradoxes, that Norway recently joined the club of those who said that our development aid funding will not go to fossil fuels. So and we will not support the poorest countries in developing their fossil fuel reserves, but we will still allow rich countries to develop their reserves and back that with financial guarantees.
I'm going to because we're tight on time, we have 2 more questions on my list, and then I'll come back to the panel for very brief comments if you have any. Beata first. Okay. Did you have?
Thank you. Just a quick 2 comments and a question there's probably no answer to. I just want to, since I was working for the UN Environment Programme, he cannot really stand up and say, you really need to listen to us. So I can say that UN Environment Programme is the only part of the international community working on green economy on that side. So, you know, World Bank's dropped it. They say they haven't, but they have, in fact, and the rest of the financial institutions have dropped it, and the governments don't want it. And so UNEP is the only one, so we need to support it, and we need to take in what he says and what the rest of the UN Environment Programme does on the green economy. So that's one point. The other point is that I'm fascinated by the fact that the Norwegian Pension Fund does internet research to see if the companies are worthy of being invested in. So that talks about the necessity of good reporting. I mean, referring to our earlier discussion. My question is, and Ivo, you brought it up, you said Norway was the only country now with a AAA rating. Pardon?
The 4 European countries.
Whatever. Why do private companies give the ratings to governments? I don't understand. We try to have a move to get international organizations, neutral organizations, to do the triple rating of whatever they're called. And economists at the Rio conference laughed at us and said, it's always been like that. Well, we said, IBM laughed at the prognosis on internet. They lost their job.
Well, I mean, I can comment on that, but I mean, from my own work perspective, I find it more interesting to work with the companies that currently control bond markets than trying to question their validity or say that they need to be in public hands. I guess that's also a debate within Europe, given that two of the biggest rating agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, are American-based. That Europe said, especially after the downgrades, we need a European credit rating agency. But that's, yeah.
Perhaps you guys can take this in during the coffee break. Jelena, did you want
it's
to?
fine.
No? Were there other comments?
No, I can do it offline. No, it's fine.
Were there other comments from the panel to finish off? No? Well then, yeah,
I'll make a quick comment. When it comes to the financial sector, I see, at least with respect to insurance and guarantees and other types of transactions which we are involved in, there is a need for further work on developing methodologies and tools in order to do this in practice. There's lots of fine discussions about, doing human rights and environmental due diligence by financial institutions, but in practice, there's not so many that are actually doing it. You don't have much leverage. In our case, we are providing insurance to a bank, which is giving a loan to an exporter, which is then delivering a small product to a much larger project. There's human rights impacts by the project developer or a contractor that is building the pipeline. What can we require of that third-party contractor if they're involved in human rights impacts? It has to be reasonable, and we need to have systems in place in order to be able to do that due diligence and make informed decisions. So I would encourage academia also to look at that because this is an area which needs increased attention.
Very briefly,
just a final. I mean, I work a lot of NGOs, and over the last years they have found the ways to financial institutions like P2GM increasingly, and it's always like financial institutions should stop financing coal or they should stop deforesting, etc. Whereas effectively what finance does, especially a pension fund, is making sure that we have money after we retire. So I think what I would encourage the audience to think about is to, whether it's from a legal perspective or a purely environmental perspective, is to look more thoroughly about the connections between environmental and social issues and how they can affect the performance or the risk of the financial products that a company works with or issues. Where at the moment it's too much aspirational, it's too much trying to change policy for policy's sake. And I think it's good to have aspirational statements, it's good to have an ethical commission, for example, which I very much applaud. But I think in terms of mainstreaming these issues, what is important is to have a much more thorough focus on making a direct link between environment and finance.
I'm just going to add to that I think we have to do all these things. We can't choose one or the other. We have to push and we have to aspire and perform together and so forth.
Anita is the next chair for the next session, so everybody stay seated and thank the panel.